In April 2026, so just recently, a massive peace treaty was signed to end a brutal, decades-long territorial war.
Right.
But, and this is the crazy part, it wasn't signed by presidents in tailored suits.
No, not at all.
It wasn't negotiated in some glittering capital city either. It was literally hammered out by local farmers, youth representatives, and nomadic herders in the middle of an oil-rich savanna.
While the governments who actually claim the land were just completely missing in action.
Exactly. So, welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are bringing you into the room for a conversation about a place that has been entirely frozen in political time for 15 years.
Yeah, it's a place where the calendar kept turning, but the fundamental question of, who actually owns the ground you're standing on was just left completely unanswered.
It's wild.
It is a genuinely incredible situation. I mean, we are looking at a region where top-down sovereign states have essentially collapsed under the weight of their own conflicts.
Yeah.
And yet the people on the ground are not just figuring out how to survive. They are actively building a functioning framework for peace entirely on their own.
Which is why our mission today is to explore this exact phenomenon. We're looking through the lens of the April 7, 2026 Declaration of Intent.
Which was signed in Abyei.
Yes, Abyei.
Yeah.
It's this fiercely disputed territory sitting right on the border between Sudan and South Sudan. And we've got a really fascinating stack of sources for you today.
We do. We're pulling from conflict analysis reports, dispatch updates, and even internal UN Security Council dynamics.
And together, they paint this incredibly vivid picture of how peace is actually built from the ground up. So, okay, let's unpack this. Because to really grasp why this document from April 2026 is such a huge deal, we had to lay down the foundation of the incredibly unique, limbo-like environment of Abyei itself.
That foundation is absolutely critical. I mean, this deep dive isn't just about a single treaty being signed on a random Tuesday.
Right, it's bigger than that.
It's a masterclass in modern conflict mediation. So just to visualize it, Abyei is roughly 10,500 square kilometers of savanna.
Which is huge.
It is, and it sits right inside the broader Nile oil basin.
Meaning it's incredibly resource-rich.
Exactly. Oil changes everything. And physically, it straddles the border between Sudan to the north and South Sudan to the south.
Okay.
And its unresolved status, it goes all the way back to the 2005 Comprehensive Peace Agreement.
Which is what ended the decades-long civil war, right?
Yes. That agreement promised Abyei a special administrative status. The whole plan was to hold a final referendum so the people living there could simply vote on whether they wanted to join Sudan or the newly forming South Sudan.
That was the plan, Aaliyah.
That was the plan. But, when 2011 rolled around and South Sudan actually gained its independence, that promised referendum in Abyei just never happened.
It was indefinitely stalled.
Completely stalled.
And looking at the sources, the reason it stalled is fascinating because it wasn't about the logistics of ballot boxes or voting locations.
No, not at all.
It was this bitter, intractable dispute over literally a single word.
Residents.
Yes, resident. Who actually counts as a resident of this territory?
Yeah.
Because you have two completely different communities claiming this land as their own.
Correct. So on one hand, you have the Ngok Dinka.
Okay.
They are largely sedentary, mostly Christian farmers. They live in Abyei year-round, cultivating the land, and they claim it as their deep ancestral home.
Year-round residents. Got it.
Right. Then on the other hand, you have the Misseriya. They are Arab Muslim nomads from the Kordofan region, which is up to the north.
And they don't stay year-round.
No. For generations, they have practiced a system of seasonal migration called transhumance. Every single year during the dry season, they migrate south through Abyei for about 6 months.
Just looking for grazing land and water.
Exactly. Grazing land and water for their massive, massive herds of cattle. And then when the rains return, they move back north.
Okay, so to put this in terms we can easily wrap our heads around, imagine you have a roommate dispute over a house.
I like this analogy.
Right. So one person lives in the house year-round. The other person has lived there for 6 months out of every single year.
And their family has done that exact same 6-month rotation for generations.
Exactly. And suddenly, a landlord shows up and says, well, we're voting on who gets the deed to the house, but only full-time residents get a ballot.
Wow. Yeah.
The year-round resident obviously feels the house is theirs. But the 6-month resident realizes that if they don't get a vote, they might be locked out of the property forever.
Which completely destroys their way of life.
Right. So that captures the existential dread perfectly, I think.
It really does. And before the division of Sudan, these two communities actually maintained a relatively peaceful coexistence.
They needed each other.
They did. But once the country split and this international border was about to be drawn right through their shared land, that historical coexistence just vanished.
It turned into a zero-sum territorial dispute.
Exactly. The Ngok Dinka believe they will easily win a referendum if it's held. But the Misseriya view any referendum that excludes them as a literal threat to their identity and survival.
Which naturally leads to the reality on the ground. I mean, how does a society even function day to day when nobody agrees on who is actually allowed to be there?
Yeah.
When you have 1 million cattle moving through active farmlands, what does that physical tension look like?
Well, this raises an important question about the geography itself. The seasonal migration of the Misseriya is simultaneously the primary engine of cooperation and the primary source of conflict.
Because they have to share the land.
Exactly. You have all these cattle needing massive amounts of water and grazing land, and they are moving directly through agricultural zones. They have to share these incredibly strained resources.
It forces them to interact.
It does, but because the sovereign states, Sudan and South Sudan, couldn't agree on that basic political question of residency, the local tension just boiled over.
Right.
By May 2011, violence broke out, and Sudanese armed forces actually seized the territory.
Which created this massive vacuum.
A huge vacuum, which meant an outside referee had to step in.
And that referee is the United Nations, specifically a mission called UNISFA. They deploy in 2011 to basically police this incredibly volatile roommate dispute.
Right.
But looking at our sources, calling them a referee almost feels too generous for what they're dealing with today.
Oh, absolutely. So UNISFA stands for the UN Interim Security Force for Abyei. Following that 2011 violence, a temporary deal established a demilitarized zone.
And UNISFA was originally deployed with Ethiopian soldiers to enforce it, right?
Yes, originally Ethiopian troops. And for the last 15 years, they have been the only stabilizing institution in a territory claimed by 2 countries but governed by neither.
Wow.
However, their ability to actually enforce anything has been systematically gutted over time.
Right. Their numbers have been severely slashed. I mean, we're talking about a massive territory. Abyei is the size of Lebanon.
Yeah.
And the UN Security Council has cut their troop ceiling down to just over 3,200 soldiers and about 640 police officers.
It's nothing.
That is a tiny footprint for an area dealing with hundreds of thousands of migrating cattle and heavily armed militias.
And it's not just a lack of manpower. It's the sheer multiplication of threats. The security reality as of early 2026 is just deeply fragile.
Because of the broader war in Sudan.
Exactly. When the Sudan war erupted in April 2023, the spillover into Abyei was immediate. Official Sudanese paramilitaries, the Rapid Support Forces, or RSF, they infiltrated northern Abyei.
Setting up checkpoints, right?
Yeah, they began setting up illegal checkpoints at the Amiot market.
Which is this crucial trading hub for both the Ngok Dinka and the Misseriya.
Exactly. It's the economic heart of the area.
And that's just the north.
Right.
On the southern border, you have South Sudan's army breaching the demilitarized lines. Plus, there are heavily armed Nor factions attacking local communities.
It's coming from all sides.
And to make matters worse, UNISFA is facing a 15% budget cut this year.
Which is devastating.
And crucial humanitarian groups, like the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, had to literally suspend their operations in mid-2025 due to a lack of funding.
The stakes couldn't be higher. And the mission itself is under literal fire.
Yeah, the sources mentioned a drone strike.
The clearest example is this tragic incident from December 2025. A drone strike hit a UN logistics base in Kadugli.
Oh, man.
It killed 6 peacekeepers from the Bangladeshi contingent and injured 8 more. Sudan blamed the RSF for the strike, though the RSF denied it.
Right, the blame game.
But regardless of who pulled the trigger, it really underscores the intense, lethal vulnerability of the peacekeepers.
Okay, wait, hold on. I have to interrupt here because this is where the logic completely breaks down for me as I'm reading this.
Okay, go ahead.
If their logistics bases are taking drone strikes and their budget is being slashed by 15%, and heavily armed militaries from 2 different national wars are pouring in from both sides,
Yeah.
why is the UN even still there? How can they possibly enforce a demilitarized zone? Yeah, aren't they essentially a toothless referee at this point?
You're hitting on the exact crisis of identity the mission faced. Your confusion is completely justified.
Okay, good.
Top-down enforcement, relying on military deterrence and mandates drafted in New York, it was fundamentally failing.
Because they just didn't have the resources.
Right. UNISFA realized they couldn't police a war zone with a shrinking budget and zero political backing from the sovereign states.
That makes sense.
That structural reality forced them to completely flip their strategy. If they couldn't enforce peace from the top down, they had to build it from the bottom up.
Meaning they turned to the people actually living in the conflict. This is the pivot to the grassroots that the sources highlight.
Yes.
Instead of waiting for presidents and generals to figure it out, UNISFA started focusing entirely on local mediation.
Exactly. They started relying on these massive community conferences. They hold them right before the dry season migration begins, and then again right after it ends. They get the actual representatives of the communities into the exact same room. For example, in December 2024, they facilitated a conference where 154 local representatives signed an agreement.
154.
Yeah. And they didn't try to solve the grand political status of Abyei. Instead, they focused on practical survival.
Like the cattle routes.
Yes, they mapped out specific corridors for the cattle to move through to avoid trampling farms.
I really want to dig into the mechanics of this because it's not just people sitting around a table signing paper.
Yeah.
The sources detail how they established this incredible institution called the Joint Community Peace Committee, or JCPC.
Right.
And they're actually enforcing these agreements through cultural mechanisms.
That is the key. The JCPC has become the backbone of conflict management there. I mean, how do unarmed civilians enforce a peace deal against armed actors?
Right.
They use established cultural norms. For instance, they negotiate systems for blood money or compensation. Yeah, if a herd of cattle destroys a crop, or, if someone is killed in a skirmish, there is a pre-agreed, culturally binding price to be paid.
And people actually respect that.
Yes. Both the Ngok Dinka and the Misseriya respect this system because it comes from their own traditions, unlike some mandate imposed by a foreign peacekeeper.
That is brilliant. And what absolutely blew my mind, looking at the sources, was the demographic shift in who was actually doing the negotiating.
Oh, the inclusion aspect.
Yeah. In a deeply traditional, very patriarchal setting, the November 2025 conference was a massive turning point. They invited newer representatives for the very first time.
Which was huge.
But even more surprisingly, women made up a third of the attendees. And in one follow-up session, women's participation reached 41%.
It's incredible.
And youth representation hit 22%.
How did that demographic shift even happen in the middle of an armed conflict?
Well, it happened out of sheer necessity. Women and youth are the ones who bear the absolute brunt of the violence and the economic devastation.
But they also hold immense informal leverage over the young men who are actually doing the fighting. And the sources point out that this rising participation of women directly tracks with a documented, measurable reduction in local conflict.
That makes total sense. I mean, instead of diplomats in suits arguing over abstract borderlines, you have local mothers and young leaders negotiating the precise routes of a cattle corridor.
And agreeing on the physical locations of water access points.
Yeah.
What's fascinating here is the psychological concept of local legitimacy. In international mediation, a top-down mandate is always fragile because the people on the ground feel no ownership over it.
They just feel like they're being told what to do.
Exactly. But in Abyei, the community leaders are the ones shaping the agreements. The co-chairs of the JCPC have consistently told UNISFA, "We own this process. Your job is to support our implementation, not dictate the terms to us."
Wow, they just took charge.
They did. And when peace is built on local legitimacy, it is incredibly difficult for rogue actors to destroy it. Because if they break the rules, they aren't defying a faceless UN bureaucracy. They are defying their own families and neighbors.
Which brings us to the massive breakthrough that triggered this entire deep dive. All those years of patient, grassroots groundwork laid the foundation for last week's event, the April 7, 2026 Declaration of Intent.
This was the moment all that local architecture really paid off. Leaders from both the Ngok Dinka and the Misseriya communities signed a formal declaration of intent.
And what did it say?
They committed to a completely weapons-free Abyei, and they pledged to work together to remove any unauthorized armed elements from their lands.
But the sources emphasize one specific detail that makes this a masterclass in mediation. They didn't just sign it with each other. They signed it with UNISFA.
Yes.
Why is that specific detail so crucial?
Because it bridges the gap between the local and the international. By signing with the UN, the communities are formally linking their grassroots commitments to international law.
Wow.
They are essentially giving the peacekeepers a community-endorsed mandate to hold them accountable. And secondly, the declaration utilizes a highly effective mediation tactic known as sequencing.
Okay, I was trying to wrap my head around sequencing when reading this.
Hmm.
Is it basically like couples therapy?
How do you mean?
Like you don't walk into the very first therapy session and try to resolve a deep betrayal from 10 years ago. You start by agreeing to take the trash out on Tuesdays so the house stops smelling, and you build trust from there.
That is the perfect analogy, yes. The political question of sovereignty, who ultimately gets the deed to Abyei, is currently impossible to solve.
Right.
So, through sequencing, they just ignored it. They focused entirely on narrow, actionable behavioral issues.
Taking out the trash.
Exactly. And in this case, the trash is the presence of unauthorized guns and those illegal checkpoints at the Amiyat market.
Right, because both sides hate those.
Yes, both communities universally agree that armed gangs are bad for local business and dangerous for their families. By focusing purely on removing the weapons, they build functional trust without forcing either side to surrender their long-term political claims to the land.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Because while this looks like a local agreement about guns and markets, it has massive international geopolitical implications.
It really does.
If you look at the UN Security Council review schedule, UNISFA is in serious trouble. Their mandate was renewed back in November 2025, but Russia, China, and Pakistan all abstained from the vote.
Right.
And the U.S. ambassador explicitly threatened to pull American funding for the mission entirely if there wasn't immediate and tangible progress.
Yeah, the pressure is immense.
There's a major Secretary General report due in August 2026 to assess if the mission should even continue.
You've hit on the geopolitical layer of this perfectly. Those abstentions by Russia, China, and Pakistan, they aren't random.
What are they about?
They reflect a broader pushback against Western peacekeeping norms and endless, open-ended UN missions that seemingly never resolve the underlying conflicts. The Security Council is just losing patience with funding a status quo.
So this grassroots declaration gives UNISFA the exact lifeline it needs to survive that August review.
Precisely. It provides a highly visible success narrative at a moment of extreme political vulnerability.
Oh, wow.
The communities in Abyei, they are acutely aware that if UNISFA's funding is pulled and the peacekeepers are forced to pack up and leave, the territory will likely descend into full-scale war.
So they need the UN just as much as the UN needs a win.
Exactly. So this declaration gives the UN something concrete to point to. They can walk into the Security Council in August and say, look, the sovereign governments might be failing, but the local people are succeeding. We have a signed, actionable framework. Do not abandon them now.
That's a fascinating symbiotic relationship. The communities are working to save the peacekeepers so the peacekeepers can continue to protect the communities.
Yeah.
But we have to look at the reality of the broader region. The local communities have delivered an absolute miracle on the ground. But how far can a local agreement really go when the sovereign states above them are completely paralyzed?
And that is what analysts call the structural ceiling. Despite all this genuine progress at the grassroots level, there is a hard, unavoidable limit to what local mediation can achieve without political movement at the state level.
Right.
And right now, the political process between Sudan and South Sudan is frozen solid.
Yeah, the sources mentioned that all the official state-level channels that were established back in 2011 are completely dormant.
Exactly. The joint oversight committees, the planned joint police forces, they haven't functioned in years. Now, there are a few tentative signs of life.
Like what?
For instance, South Sudan's president, Salva Kiir, reconstituted a high-level committee for Abyei in October 2025.
Okay.
And Sudan's foreign ministry recently indicated they are willing to resume bilateral meetings. But realistically, any genuine, permanent stabilization of Abyei depends entirely on the trajectory of the broader war in Sudan, which remains deeply, deeply chaotic.
So if I'm listening to this and I'm watching the news 6 months from now, what are the canaries in the coal mine? How do we know if this peace deal is actually working or if it was just another piece of paper?
Well, there are a few key markers you should watch. First, operational reality.
Okay.
Do the illegal paramilitaries actually disappear from the Amiyat market? Does the UN report a drop in armed violence during the migration season?
So physical proof.
Right. Second is community stamina. When a dispute inevitably arises over a trampled farm, do the joint community peace committees actually convene to enforce the blood money systems, or do people reach for their rifles?
Do they stick to the process?
Exactly.
And I imagine the funding aspect is a massive marker as well.
It might be the most critical. If organizations like the FAO do not get the funding to restore their humanitarian activities, the basic livelihood pressures, the desperate fight for water, for grazing land, for food, will simply overwhelm whatever goodwill is generated by the April 7 declaration.
Right. If you're starving, a piece of paper doesn't mean much.
Exactly.
So what does this all mean? When you pull back from the geopolitics and the UN resolutions, the big picture synthesis here is really profound.
It is.
The ultimate lesson from Abyei is about the actual role of international intervention in the 21st century. The UN couldn't impose peace by military force, especially not with a slashed budget.
Right.
But by providing a safe space for local legitimacy to flourish, they enabled the people to build their own guardrails. It proves that international actors are often most effective as facilitators, not as substitute sovereigns.
Absolutely.
And conversely, it shows that starving these peacekeeping missions of resources isn't just a bureaucratic budget cut. It creates an immediate vacuum that warlords and militias will happily fill.
Yeah. It is a precarious victory. The April 7 declaration is a meaningful, historic step, but it is operating within a highly volatile environment.
Extremely volatile.
Its true value will be tested in the discipline of its implementation over the coming dry and rainy seasons.
They are walking a razor-thin tightrope, just surviving on the sheer willpower of local farmers and nomads, alongside an underfunded UN mission.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it forces us to confront a highly provocative idea.
Oh, it's that.
Abyei has existed in this state of suspended political animation for 15 years. An entire generation has grown up with no sovereign state.
Wow, 15 years, yeah.
If temporary structures like local peace committees managing cattle corridors and UN peacekeepers serving as referees, if they end up being the only functioning governance over a generation, do we need to fundamentally rethink our global obsession with drawing final permanent borders?
That's a huge question.
Right. Perhaps in the 21st century, for disputed places like Abyei, these interim community structures shouldn't be viewed as a waiting room for a nation-state. Maybe they need to be legitimized and funded as the permanent solution itself.
Because maybe the roommates don't actually need a landlord to tell them who owns the building, as long as they can agree on how to share the kitchen.
Exactly.
It is an incredible testament to the resilience of the human spirit in Abyei. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the world around you, keep looking for the mechanisms beneath the headlines, and we will catch you next time.